And we are live. Good morning, Dan.
Hello. Hey, Tommy.
Hey,
Thanks for having me.
what, what's going on? I'm really excited for this conversation. So, Dan, I'm just going to kick it right into the
All
introduction
right.
for you because I'm stoked for this. But I mean, I think you've been into the digital design field now for almost 20 years, right? You've been running
A
Super
little bit more
Friendly.
than that. Yeah.
A little more than 20. Okay, awesome. And Super Friendly, you've been working with clients like Nike, United Airlines, Marriott, and specifically recently, for how many years now, helping them with design systems?
Yeah. About 5 years. 5 years ago, like we were doing it, but we were doing a bunch of other stuff like web design and app design and all that. And then as of 5 years ago, we're like, this is the stuff that we like to do. Let's just go all in on design systems. And it's been great ever since.
Yeah, and you fell on my radar specifically when you and Brad Frost were collaborating and talking about better collaboration between designers and developers. Because I mean, that
Yes.
was a big, like complex topic. What are the right tooling? How do we, do handovers? Brad Frost, who really helped me with his Atomic Design book, I liked that a
Totally.
lot. And so you were working with Dribble and doing a lot of workshops with them, and I think you're still doing that right now, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep.
And then most recently, so you've written and you've done a lot of talks on design systems, but most recently you've released design systems in 90 days. And that's something that I'm actually really excited to dig into today.
Yeah, cool. We've had a lot of clients that like every time they contact us, they're like, "So, what's the process?" And I think they're expecting like, "Oh, here's like a graph, or here's like a little graphic of our process." And I'm like, "I mean, I could just write a book on it." And after so many clients being like, "Well, could I like see that book?" We're like, "Well, all right, let's just write the book." And out popped design system in 90 days. Like this is our process. These are the 52 things we would do, to help get your design system set up. So it's
I
all there.
I
It's all
I
recorded now.
have needed that for so long. I have had very harrowing experiences being like the first designer at companies trying to roll out design systems. And the one thing, like one of my first touch points with a really mature design system was it was like inherited from, and I can't remember his name, but he was the designer. He was like a lead contributor to Zerb's foundation,
Oh
and he
yeah.
came into this company Quantcast, and he like built up their design system. And I was like, whoa, this is 2016. I'm like, this is like really mature and awesome. And then I've tried to replicate that in places I've gone elsewhere. And the only thing that any of those had in common was that how like the inception of the design system never started from the same place. It was
Yeah.
always like its own shape. There was no commonality. And I'm like, I don't know if there's a right way to do this.
Totally. I think right is contextually relevant. It's like right for one organization is gonna be wrong for another organization. So to me, I think of a lot of design system work as cultural work. So you got to figure out what fits in the culture, what is easily adopted, and I think that's why the idea of adoption in design systems is such a big idea. And there's no one fit for doing it. There's lots of different ways, and I think that's what I like about it is you can be creative. There's like a multiverse of options as to how to get a design system have traction.
Have you ever read The Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt? Have you heard of this book?
No, I haven't even heard of it. No.
Like it was, there's maybe some dogmatic approaches to certain things in UX, but the thing, like, is I'm banging my head against the wall trying to figure out how to get this design system created. The Goal is kind of this narrative story, and it takes place in like the late 80s, and it's a manufacturing manager, and he's trying to figure out like what's the best system to make us move faster. And the entire takeaway is like, don't forget, like, what is the goal of your company? To make money, right? Like that's the goal. And not, there might be some tried and true practices, but sometimes you just got to like shimmy up some stuff and make that thing work, right? And that was really
Yeah.
helpful for me. But I didn't have your book. I didn't have like steps that I could actually do this. What
We
was
we try hard in the book to say like here is one playbook for how to do it. This is not the playbook on how to do it. Like this is what we've found experience with so far. But that's why I think we do consulting on top of that too, is because you might take the workbook and go, okay, of these 52 steps, 48 of them are relevant to us. These other four, they don't really fit with our culture because we have this kind of team or because we have this kind of leadership. So I'm under no illusion that like there's one right way to do it, but hopefully at least some of these steps could be helpful.
Well, and I like that this information is coming out because I think like if we look at 2022 right now, and I'm deep in this, I'm curious what you're seeing, right? I'm deep into thinking like, oh, people at least have heard the word design system. But is that true? Like in 2022, how much education are you still having to do in explaining like the definition of a design system?
It's a little hard to say for sure. And part of that is because our clients and the people that are coming to us sort of self-select. Like we try to be
Mhm.
really upfront with our positioning and with our marketing to say, like, this is what we do. We do design systems work. So probably folks that aren't familiar with the terms that we use and the writing and the blogging and all that stuff, they probably just don't even contact us in the first place. So I don't have an opportunity to talk to them as much. A lot of the clients that come to us nowadays, they have had a design system for 3 years, 5 years already. Whereas if you would have asked me, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, a lot of our clients were coming to us to help build or design their first design system. Now, almost none of our clients are that. So now most of our clients are saying, hey, we've had a design system for 3 years or 5 years or 8 years. And what we really need help with is people aren't contributing as much as we thought they would. There's no
Mm.
governance process that we thought we would have established by now. Like, could you help us establish some of those things? So that's a lot of what I'm seeing is a lot of companies start design systems by going like, let's just make the common set of components, right? And then hopefully a bunch of people use them. And we tend to call that a way to get like a design system graveyard, which is a bunch of design system attempts that nobody actually uses because the mentality is generally like, if we build it, they will come. And that's not true when it comes to, I think, all digital products. Just because you build it doesn't mean you're going to have customers. You have to find this like product market fit somewhere. So how do you do that in design? So that's the kind of stuff that we tend to help with.
You said a quote that I heard recently, which was, why don't they use our drop-down component? And your response to that was, well, because it was easier for them to get it from Bootstrap than it was to get it from wherever it's hosted for you. And
Totally.
that's such an almost obvious statement, but I think that captures like the entirety of it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I kind of hate this. Tech is very stressful for people. For a lot of people, tech is a stressful job. So for them, it's not about like, in an ideal world, you can explore options and use this thing and experiment with this and try out a bunch. But some people just have to get their jobs done, and there's risk if they don't. They get fired, they can't afford to find a new job, they maybe can't get a new so there's a lot of pressure that comes with it. So when people have the choice between I have a deadline by the end of the week and I could try to figure out our design system, or I mean, material design's been around for 10 years and it's pretty great, I'll just use that. It's an easy choice for them to make. It's not the right choice, but right is relative. Again, right is contextual. So they're going to pick the thing that helps them get their deadline done because otherwise they are at risk.
Yeah, well, and it's funny you say that because it's like, okay, we're going to create a design system. Go to Google, like top design systems in 2022.
Right, right.
Where's the institutional knowledge, the reference I'm pulling from? How many design systems are you running into that look like the top 10 lists of the design systems we're trying to take influence from?
Almost none.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge is that people see that as a bad thing. I see that as a great thing. It's like a design system is not something that is, art. It's not something that's like just your portfolio piece. You should be able to put it in your portfolio if you're working on it. Like that's a good thing. But if you work at a computer company, well, your design system should be made to create computer company stuff. Whereas if you work at an events company, your design system should be made to make event company stuff. And material design is not that. Material design is awesome, and the team there has been working on it for a long time. They made it for Google products. So if your company doesn't make products that are like Google products, at some point it's going to be an awkward fit. So a lot of times when I'm working with teams, I'm like, try to make the design system that your company needs. Don't try to make a design system that like looks like all the other ones. Because if it looks like all the other ones, how do you know like it's a good fit for yours?
Yeah. Yeah. So when you see your clients and you're like, okay, we've got a graveyard over here, a well-meaning effort that just didn't get the legs it needed to move. Are you going in there and dissecting what didn't work about that, or are you starting from kind of a clean slate usually?
I believe that there's always good to be found. Like, so in a design system graveyard, there's probably some nuggets in those design system attempts that like, oh, that's cool. We should unearth that and we should build on that. Um, so yes, I'll do that. But I would say, I don't know, 8 times out of 10, I can diagnose before even looking at it, like what the problems were. And the problems were generally are that they didn't do enough research. They didn't do enough. Like, what does that team need, and what does that team need, and what does that team need? Instead, what they did was, this is again speculation, but 8 times out of 10 of it is right. People start with buttons. They go, well, we need buttons, right? So we got to start with buttons. And I'm like, but how do you know that you need buttons? It's a good assumption, but you didn't test that assumption. So a lot of the design systems that I've worked on lately, and again, like I said, we don't do a lot of design systems from scratch, but we've worked on a few lately for a couple companies, and those design systems don't have buttons in them, which sounds like blasphemy, right? Oh, you gotta have buttons. But I'm like, but if all the product teams can build their own, but they don't have a problem building their own buttons. You know what they'd have a problem with? The autocomplete dropdown that needs to bring up the list of products
Yeah.
like that company makes. Spend your time working on that, and then you'll save teams a week if you work on that. Instead, a team will spend 2 weeks working on buttons, and everybody's like, I mean, the buttons are nice, but we have our own. Like, thanks, but no thanks. So a lot of times when I see design system graveyard, I'm like, it's probably because they didn't try to understand their customers as much. And again, this is like what product design 101. You talk to your customers, you find out what their pain points are, and you try to solve the big ones as immediately as you can. That's what your MVP is. So I think a lot of people think it's blasphemy. You have to have buttons and cards and headers and footers, right? And I'm like, no, I've worked on design systems where the top 3 components are this really complex drop-down thing, this table grid thing that everybody uses, and some obscure component that no other design system has. That's a really good design system. Those 3 components.
I'm totally guilty of, well, let's capture like our vertical rhythm and our buttons first, because that's the easiest path to output so that we can demonstrate like how this is supposed to look moving forward. And what you just said blew my mind. That's going back to like, what's the goal here, right? Well, buttons aren't going to increase the velocity. It's that really complicated table component that's going to increase velocity.
Totally. And I think, like, I love how you said, like, it's about output. Design systems aren't about output. They're about outcome. You know, and so, and I know that's a common phrase in lots of different industries. It's like a lot of people especially designers. Designers are really guilty of this. And I, you know, as a designer myself, I'm guilty of it. You know, I'm worried about output. But if I'm not worried about outcome, I may actually output the wrong thing. But I go like, well, I checked the box because my job was to design 60 components, and I did it, and they look beautiful, and the Figma library is organized really well, and so job well done, right? And then no one actually uses it, and that's where the design system graveyard comes from.
So you get into an environment, you're looking at the design system they might have had, or you're trying to figure out the next strategy. What are you seeing, or what are you advocating for in the makeup of a team? Right, that design system team, and kind of the decision making that's happening there.
A lot of teams in tech have this like trifecta, this 3-legged stool, right? Product design, engineering. And one of the things I love about design system work is that not one of those people can do it on their own, right? If you just had an engineer on a design system, you're missing stuff. If you just have a designer on a design system, you're missing stuff. If you just have a product person on a design system, you're missing stuff. So collaboration is so important to design systems, definitely between those 3 disciplines. And then even within that, there's duos where product and design have to work together a certain way. Design and engineering have to work together a certain way. Product and engineering have to work together a certain way. So that's why I focus a lot on workflow. Like, to me, if you don't solve the workflow part of design systems, it doesn't matter if the engineering is good and the design is good and the product is good. It's how they intersect, right? And that's what makes it a system, is how things are connected. So not only do the components and the design libraries and the UI kits, like not just the technical stuff and the artifacts have to be connected, which is hard enough, but the process has to be connected. The strategy has to be connected. The workflow has to be connected. So I almost never teach design systems or coach design systems without coaching on workflow, because if you don't, there's a ceiling on there already.
So who's writing the actual like plain language rules of the documentation? Which, as I came to find out myself, like that's a whole effort. Like that is not just like, it's one thing to code the component, to show where it lives in the framework, to grab a screenshot from Figma or Sketch. It's another thing to like write the actual documentation.
Yes, I think a lot of folks treat that as a phase. When you treat it as a phase, it's tough. It's same thing with, I feel the same about, like, if you treat design as a phase, you're missing it. If you treat engineering as a phase, you're missing it. The way that I teach it is everyone has to work on that together. Right. So part of that just means like deprogramming or changing people's minds about where certain work goes. If you document at the end, all right, we're going to design this component in Figma, then the engineer is going to build it and put it in Storybook or whatever. And then we're going to document it. It almost never happens that way. Like, then documentation gets really hard, because who documents? The designer has done their job. The engineer has done their job. Who documents? Oh, the writer. Oh, we don't have a writer on our team. Or, well, the writer doesn't understand APIs well enough to be able to document this. So I try to change the mindset of people when I'm working with teams, where I say, we're not documenting, we're chronicling. And what are we chronicling? Not the API, not the specs, not that this has 4 pixels below and this has 8. Like, that stuff is important, but we're trying to chronicle the process of how we did this. So we're trying to write a story together. And I love, there's lots of people have different versions of this. Brad Frost has a great one where he says a design system is a story of how your organization makes digital interfaces. And I've amended that a little bit to say, like, it's the collection of stories. How did we make that one product? Well, if we chronicle it, then another team can make it the same way. And then another team can make it the same way after that. And this collection of stories becomes our Bible, our playbook, or whatever we want to call it. This is how we make products here. The product person does this at this time. The engineer does this at this time. But a lot of it is overlapping. So I try to change the mindset of let's chronicle together. And if you change that mindset, it's like not everyone feels like they can write documentation, but everyone can chronicle. Everybody can write a journal. Hey, I did this thing today. Oh, I worked on the components, color contrast today. And then I showed it to the engineer and we had this meeting and we talked about this. So to me, like, it's actually more valuable to chronicle like almost the oral history of how you've made it, as opposed to like what we made at the end and this is the specs of it. And I find like when you think about it as documentation, you sort of think about it as like, well, we have to record the specs. And honestly, that's dry work and it's boring work. There are people who love that, which cool, but not every team is blessed with a person who loves that work. So it feels like a drag. It feels like, oh, we got to document now. And then nobody does it. I mean, the last story I'll share here, literally one time I was working on a design system with some friends, and we were literally at Disney World. We were at Disney World for an event. And instead of going to Disney World, we were all in our hotel rooms writing documentation. And I'll never forget that because I'm like, never again will I skip Disney World to write documentation. We got to change how this works. So to me, I'm like, if Disney World's on the line, we're going to go to Disney World. We're not going to go write documentation. And chronicling actually helps us go to Disney World.
I love that. that is a great analogy for how I feel about documenting as well. Well, and I want to take it back real quick to, you were talking about the importance of like designers understanding the developer side and vice versa. And I think that's so important is your book talks about teaching designers about how Git's being used, Storybook, right? And then teaching the developers like how Figma's being used. So you can really think about, because there's back of house stuff that like on the design and developer side that no one else is privy to. So how much time do you actually suggest like baking in a cost for that?
A ton, a lot. Like it is an investment, and it is an investment that almost always pays off. So sometimes when I'm working with a client, the shock that comes in is I say to them, if you're going to hire us, the first 6 weeks, expect no output from this team. And they're like, whoa, like 6 weeks of no output? And because those 6 weeks, we're building culture together. Right? And let me qualify that to say, to me, what culture means is like, what's the stuff that we do normally? What is normal here? So if normal is the designer goes away and does this thing, and then the engineer follows and does, like, if that's what's normal, we have to break that. So it takes time for things to be deprogrammed and reprogrammed in people's brains. Like our brains just don't go like, I learned a new thing, I'll apply it right away, and it'll make sense to me right away, because we're fighting what we're used to. So that takes time to like sink in. A lot of times we'll teach stuff to teams in design system work, and then they'll go like, I need a day to just like let this simmer. Cool. And if you don't have the space to do that, it's really tough. So, a lot of the workbook, there's a big chunk of the workbook devoted to, we're going to teach each other things. Designers are going to teach the engineers on the team how they design stuff. Engineers on the team are going to teach the rest of the team how to build a component, how they think about assembling a page. And I would say almost every time I've done this, and all of our teams that we work with are very senior level designers, very senior level engineers. And every time there is some designer that goes like, I had no idea that's how you build a web page, or an engineer that's like, that's how Figma works. Like it's mind blowing to them. And it's like, it opens their minds. And I think that's the thing that you need for design systems. You need like an open mind. And you can't have an open mind if you're assuming how your teammates work and you're totally wrong about it. Some engineers have never seen a designer actually work in Figma, and it feels clumsy, but a lot of times we're going to spend the next 4 hours and all of us are going to watch Joe design. And that's weird for everyone. It's weird for Joe too. Joe's like, oh, this is weird, but like Joe, we're going to screen. And that's what I love about tools like Figma is, hey, we could watch people design. You could just snoop on them, but we're actually going to call it out publicly. We're going to watch Joe design for the next 20 minutes. And Joe, we're going to ask you questions about, how you're doing this. And, engineers would be like, hey, why did you change that? How does auto layout work? And then designers go, oh, auto layout kind of works like Flexbox in CSS. Okay, cool. And then they'll show it. And then engineer will go, actually, that's not how Flexbox works though. And they'll go, oh, thought that's how Flexbox. I thought auto layout was exactly how Flexbox. Well, it's not. It's close, but it's not. And that moment, like there's a ton of those moments where an engineer goes, well, I assume that's what it was going to be, or a designer goes, I assume that's how it's going to be. But when we unlock that stuff, I think there's a lot more empathy for we can work together because we understand each other's tools better, or understand each other's processes better. And I think that is integral to a successful design system practice and culture.
So you bake that in kind of like the onboarding stage, and then it sounds like at least you talk about hot potatoing, practice
Yeah.
hot potatoing,
Yeah.
and that's kind of how you carry that through like ideally, I mean, that becomes part of the culture, right?
Yes. Every week, the designers and engineers and product people have to hot potato. And hot potato, for those that aren't familiar, hot potato is passing work back and forth in small chunks as quickly as possible, which again, for some teams is just totally unusual. You know, for a lot of teams, it's like, well, design happens and then engineering happens. It never goes back to design other than for QA or red lines or, you know, anything like that. But that's not hot potato. Hot potato is I'm going to work on a little bit, and then an engineer is going to work on it a little bit, and then a product person is going to work on it a little bit, and then the writer is going to work on it a little bit, and then this person, and it's just passing it back and forth as quickly as possible. To me, that's more along the lines of the spirit of Agile anyway. Small chunks, we pass it back and forth as we need to. So that's part of a thing that we try to drill into a design system team's culture. And then they get used to hot potatoing. And then everybody sees that. All the product teams go like, how'd you make that so quickly? Oh, we do hot potato. What's hot potato? And they get to teach a product team how to do it. And then slowly, little by little, it becomes part of the organization's culture, not just the design team's culture.
Absolutely. That's awesome. I love hearing about that. The big thing though, you know, you go into triage a company and you see kind of like, here's what they're working on, here's where we can make some improvements. Is there ever a time where you think it's either too soon or too late to be thinking about a design system?
It's a tough question. There's definitely a too soon. I think there's a too late, and in between those two is such a narrow window. Like there's a real narrow sweet spot of like, when is the perfect time to make a design system? It's a very small window. I also think that like it's okay if it's too late. If it's too early, I think it's actually tougher. So to me, when I think of too early for a design system to me is a tool for scale. So if you're working on one product, I'm like, I don't know if you need a design system. It actually might be too much effort. You know, if you have one product, to make a design system, you actually just should work on that one product. Like you'd probably be better served to do that. And there's going to be inefficiency that you create in that process. There's going to be design debt and engineering debt, but that's fine. It's a manageable amount. I think the teams that are trying to prevent debt, I'm like, I think that's an exercise in futility. Like you're going to have debt somewhere. It's fine. There's a such thing as good debt and bad debt. Same thing in finances, right? So same thing on design and engineering. Like if you are working on two or more products, or you're going to, that's where I think a design system comes in handy. Because a design system is, and this is a guideline that I give to teams, is like, what components should go in the design system and which ones shouldn't? Well, 3 or more is my guideline. If 3 or more teams need this, then let's figure out how it goes in the design system. If only 2 teams need it, let's hold on it. Like we don't need to put that in there. But if this is a tool for scale, let's really focus on the things that most people need, the common stuff, you know, not the things that like, oh, everything could go in there. And if you talk to a lot of the teams that have had design systems for a while, a lot of them are taking components out of their design systems, right? They like go up to like, we have 120 components in our design system, and then they actually drop back down to 80 or 50 or something, because they realize we're just gonna support the things that really everyone needs. And then, you know, all the things that are outliers, each team can kind of deal with that on their own. Like, and that's actually a better level of support for them.
So, you know, and your point about debt, and I heard someone say it, you know, the design system is really about managing the complexity. And you talk about your point about debt. And maybe paying off that debt can be looked like retrofitting almost. How do you go into retrofitting? Like, when do you say, yes, this pilot program or this component was a success? Now we've got to pay off the debt where that component needs to live and currently doesn't.
Yeah, it's tough because there's a great graph that my friend Ben Callahan made. Ben runs Sparkbox, which is a great agency in Dayton, Ohio. They work on design systems, and I think it's called the design system efficiency curve. And for some amount of time, the curve is below the zero line, right? The zero axis, because at some point you always feel behind the need. oh, 10 teams need this component. We only have 2 people to work on it right now. We can't get it to them in time. They're going to ship their own version, and now the debt has increased. So you just feel behind. But the hope that I have for everybody is like at some point the curve goes above the line. It becomes positive, and then you start to feel ahead of oh, we actually have some space here. Like those 3 teams have used a couple of components that we have. They're better off. Yep, there's another 10 teams that haven't quite used the design system yet, but that's okay. But we've got some space, and I think that the paying off the debt goes into space, right? So similar to finances, it's like when you have a mountain of debt, you have a ton of credit card debt, it feels like you will never get ahead on it. But then, something might happen. You might get a raise at your job or a bonus, or, some relative passes away and you get some windfall, whatever it is, you get the IRS check back from the IRS, a refund. And then you go, oh, I actually could pay off this credit card. And for somehow that gives you a little bit of space. And you go, oh, actually, with this space, I wonder if I could do something with this space that actually gets me ahead. So I think the same thing about design and engineering debt is there's a lot of teams that feel like they'll always be behind. But take heart, you won't always be behind. At some point, you'll get some space. And that space might only be like, we got a couple of days, before we have to start with this other round of teams. Well, those couple of days are days that you can use to pay off that debt. And then eventually that couple of days, if your design system's going well, that'll turn into a couple of weeks and sometimes a couple of months. And it might not be evenly spread. It might be that your engineer on your design system team has some space, but your design system designer doesn't. That's okay. Like it might not be even at first, but I think that you can build up some of that space, and that's where you start to pay off, your larger debts.
Now, I know that this question is very contextually specific, but at least I've seen some design system efforts turn into graveyards because they stayed under that 0 for too long. What do you think is like a worrying amount of time before you start to actually see that uptick versus what's probably average or acceptable?
I don't know. Maybe this is like an unpopular answer or an unsatisfactory answer, but honestly, a lot of it I think is dependent on the tolerance or the patience of your sponsor, right? So like a lot of times at organizations, you have maybe like a VP of design that has sort of blessed the effort. You talk about design system buy-in. Usually there's somebody that's like, okay, we are going to spend 6 months on this effort, or we're going to allocate enough budget and resources to have a team dedicated to this for a year. Probably in their mind, they have some amount of tolerance, whether they realize it or not. Like they'll probably have this, like, if this doesn't take in a year and a half, in 90 days, 90 days or, 18 months or whatever it is, they're going to be like, let's call it and say that this is not worth it. I think it's in every design system team's best interest to identify that time period as soon as possible, because then you'll know if you're marching up to it. And like you said, it's contextual for every organization. Some have a lot of tolerance for it where they're like, we could tolerate this for the next 18 months if we don't see traction. And then others are like, if we don't see traction in the next 6 months, we're going to shut this initiative down. So I think it's worth identifying what that is from that stakeholder. Ask directly, as a way to do that. If not, try to look for where your leaders' priorities are and try to look for timelines associated with those. And then you could say, okay, well, that effort for the rebrand, they're trying to get that done in the next 6 months. Okay, so maybe that means we have 6 months or a little bit less than that to get our side of that done. So look for that tolerance, because I think that's the time where you're going to be surprised if somebody goes, it's time to shut this thing down, because it hasn't had enough traction.
So what are you doing to really help get the buy-in across that, hey, this ROI will come to fruition? And here's kind of what we're going to look for. What are some maybe analogies or strategies you've used that have been successful?
So I like to look back at product design 101. To me, like startups are a good analogy, because in a startup, you are trying to create a product, trying to find product market fit, especially funded startups, right? You have someone who's given you money, and they will continue to give you money or attention or whatever if you show traction. So to me, in any good product, you have to show traction. And any amount of traction is good. Hey, we had 1 user this month. We have 3 users next month. Hey, traction, that's great. And the more momentum you build, the more traction you can prove. So I think one of the mistakes that I see a lot of people do with design systems is they pitch vaporware to their sponsor, to their investor. Even though that investor is not investing money, they're investing resources or teams or people. So what a lot of people do is they go, okay, we're going to go into our VP of design's office or our CFO or whoever it is, and we're going to pitch the value of a design system as as this design system created value for these other organizations. Hey, this is what Target did, or this is what American Express did, or this is what this other company, this Lyft did with their design system. But they have no traction because they haven't even done anything. So they're basically asking for investment in nothing. It would be like going to a VC and saying, like, I have an idea. Will you give me money? And there are some people in our society where that works, and most of us it does not work. Instead, what do VCs respond well to? They respond well to, you've already built a product, and you go, hey, we've got 100 active users this month. We think we can get it to 250 next month, and then here's our projection for. That's much easier to invest in because there's already a signal of traction. So what I recommend to design system teams is, like, don't worry about the buy-in before you've built something. Build something under the radar. And it does take a little bit of investment on your part first. You might have to spend an extra couple of nights, doing this. You might have to spend some of your weekend time going, like, we're going to build a design system or a handful of components that we know teams need, and we're going to get it integrated into production, however we can do that. One of my favorite stories is, I don't know if this is true or not, but when the founders of Stripe first built Stripe, they would pitch Stripe to people. And then if people would say, like, that sounds pretty cool, they would go, like, give me your laptop. And they would literally install Stripe on their laptops, like, do the work for them. And I recommend that to design system teams too, where I'm like, build components. But then if somebody says, like, that sounds cool, get in their code base and drop that component in their code base right now. Like, grab their computers from them, like, force them to do a working session with you and do it right there. And then after you've done that 2 or 3 times, then go to your executive leader and say, hey, listen, we've done this with these 3 teams over the last 2 weeks, and we actually saved 2 weeks by doing it. So we broke even on this. Could you give us 6 weeks to do another experiment where we think we can save 3 weeks and we could actually do better than breaking even? That's much easier for an executive to say yes to, because the ask is small and there's already proven traction. So I think that's the way that you can do it very early on, is you go, I know we only saved a week, but we've only been working on this for 2. So if you let us work on it for 6, maybe we could save 8, right? And the math works in your favor, if you're doing the work in that way.
So I'm going to piggyback on this, and I've actually got a few scenarios that I want to see. How would you potentially handle these? The context is kind of free form, but in that scenario, you've been greenlit for like a pilot, and you've made some work, and now you do need to show the ROI to your stakeholders. And it sounds like you're saying you can measure how long it's taken versus how long maybe a similar objective took in the past. But are there any other, like, instrumentation plays that you can use to actually measure the ROI and surface that to people?
It's very difficult. And part of that is because design system tooling is new. Like, design systems in our industry are, have only taken off in the last, let's say, 10 years. Even though that idea has been around for a long time, we've sort of, like, integrated into our processes in tech. So tooling is behind. Like, I don't know of any good design system analytics that are not homegrown. I know Figma has design system analytics, but that means something a little bit different because they're just talking about kind of UI and GUI usage, not implementation and code bases. So a lot of teams that I know that have built it from scratch. So I think the segment team, I think, is part of Twilio now. Like, they built their own dashboard to track. A lot of people are building their own tools, but there's not a lot of tooling. And especially for an early design system team, if you haven't even built a design system yet, probably you haven't invested the time to build analytics tooling for it too. So that one's tough. A lot of times early, it's qualitative. There's not a lot of quantitative that you can do unless you can somehow find the time to invest in some telemetry to say, before we start anything, we're going to do a benchmark. We're going to look at or we have the data available to say, on average, this is how long it takes for teams to do a project or to ship a feature, and so we're going to measure based on that baseline, and we're going to track every day manually through some spreadsheet that our product manager is going to update. So it's pretty manual at first. A lot of times what I look for is qualitative. So, what we'll do is a team that I worked with recently, we built a component based on what we thought this team needed. We talked to them about what they needed. We talked to them about the requirements. We built a first proof of concept. We shared it with them. They said, like, the API is a little bit off. Okay, cool. We go back to the drawing board. We revise it, go back to this team. And then we basically ask for a screen share usability test. We said, like, can you share your screen? We have the component. We think it's what you need. Could you just walk us through trying to implement it on your own? And I go, okay, cool. So there's engineers implementing this component on their own. And we schedule a 30-minute meeting for this, and they're done in 5 minutes. And we're like, okay, what do you think of that? Like, how did it go? That was really easy. Hey, how much time do you think that saved you? Oh, I mean, I don't know. Like, could you guess? Like about a week. Great. That's all the qualitative thing that we do. So then we take that and we present that back to our stakeholder at the end of the week. Hey, we tested it with this team, and the direct quote that we put in the presentation is, I don't know, about a week. Right? That's what we put in there because that's the data that we had. We didn't say we guarantee we save a week to engineer. No, we saved about a week, for an engineer. But that's one. And just keeping the stakeholders apprised, like, hey, look at the traction that we're making. Look at this stuff. Like that's I think some of the stuff that moves. It changes minds, early on. Later on, you can develop more sophisticated tooling. You could automate that. You could say, oh, we've saved, 68% on this thing and this and that thing. But early on, I think it's going to be very qualitative.
So much of implementing a design system, I mean, it's one for one taking a product to market.
Totally.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's
I mean,
crazy.
this is what people mean when they say a design system is a product. It's like all the stuff that you're trying to do when you're creating a startup or creating a digital product that you're trying to market it is you have to be in touch with customers a lot. You have to revise a lot. You have to iterate. You have to change your assumptions. You have to learn really fast. Like all of that stuff applies to design system work. I think a lot of people treat design systems like projects. And if they treat it like project, it's different. It is an internal product that you're making, and you have to find product market fit. Otherwise, your startup will die. Otherwise you will not find traction. You will run out of runway, and then you'll get reallocated. So yeah, I think there's a lot about product creation that applies to design system adoption.
So here's a scenario. There's a designer out there, maybe design hire one or two, and they're working across 4 different teams spread thin. There's no time for anything, right? It's wartime product design. And they recognize across these teams the need for standardization across a couple of patterns that just does not exist yet. But there is no time, and they're not well equipped to sell the idea of a design system. What's something they can do to start working towards that greater goal?
I think there's two ends of a spectrum, and usually I'll provide this to the team working on, or even if it's, like in this scenario, it's like one designer or one person. I'll present to them which option they want to pick, which one they prefer. Some people really like I'm just going to do the easiest thing that I can do right now. Like, it takes me 45 minutes and then at least it's something done. And then some people go, I don't mind doing hard work right now if I know it's going to pay off in a bigger way. So those are the scenario that I'll present to this designer. Like, you want to do something really easy that has a little bit of traction, but it didn't take you a long time? Or are you like, I'm in for kind of a bigger effort because I know it'll pay off? And so if they choose the first option, if they choose I want to do something easy, I'll go, okay, what is something that you know for sure everyone could use right now and it would save them 30 minutes of work? Well, if I wired up the way that our icons work in Figma, I could do that over the next hour, and it'll save these 10 designers 30 minutes right now. Great, work on that. Next couple hours, you have it done by the end of the day. That's traction. So that's one path, is just do something that moves the needle a little bit, and spend a little bit of time on it, knowing that it'll move a little bit. And then on the other side of it, it's I really can do something that has a lot of traction. Okay, cool. So in that case, spend the next week trying to organize the way that all of our headings across all of our product, or our typography around all of our product, is going to work, and pair with an engineer to get just typography in code in an implementable way right now. And then try to get it into 2 products by the end of this week. Can you do that? Yeah, okay. That. So that designer might be like, all right, I have to block everything out for a week, but I know that if we do that, that'll move the needle a lot, over the next week. So I usually try to give one thing, but I let them choose the appetite for it. You want to bite off a big thing, you want to bite off a small thing, and then let the work effort be appropriate or proportional to the traction on it.
Some organizations, I even had one time, this is a very specific example, that's why I asked the question, where there wasn't time, but what we didn't have was just a place where people could understand what existed in our giant, robust product. And so just even having a visual inventory. And at first I was like, oh, I got to create all these components inside of Figma. It's like, no, you don't. Just go and screen capture every component and just have a static JPEG and categorize them with a header. And there you go. You can now refer to this with your design team and your engineers. These are the ones that exist. And then eventually the conversation, it's not a bridge too far to start saying, hey, we maybe want to move away from these and more towards this column.
That's such a great example. Yeah, I love that.
Now, in a follow-on scenario, you actually have a seriousness of a team that wants to go towards a design system, but they're also in the middle of a migration of JavaScript frameworks. I'm sure you've seen this, right? We're moving away from Backbone, we're going towards React, and we have 3 threads of the same component. We have the legacy component, let's call it a table. Then we have the new component in React where we want things to be. And then we have a team that's like about to ship something next week. They're no longer using the legacy component, but they have like an ad hoc in React. How do you manage that kind of complexity? And like, what do you do to take steps to move through that?
Oh, that's a really tough one. Because that's a mindset question, right? That there's no technical solution to that, right? The technical solution is like, I don't know, work harder, smarter, and like don't make mistakes. like you can't do that, right? So that's a mindset question. A lot of times, what I'll work on with the team, this is what I love about great design system teams is they always look at the possibilities. We could do all of this stuff, and I think that's where a lot of design system work stems from. Is look at all the opportunity that lies ahead of us. If we could consolidate, if we could be more efficient, if we could optimize, there's a whole road of opportunity ahead of us. So good design system teams are good at that. They're good at looking at opportunity. What generally they're not good at is deciding what not to do. And I think a lot of design system work is deciding what not to do. Like I said, with the mature design system teams, they have made the decision, we're just not going to support custom dropdown. Like, we're not, and I think that's a really mature decision. It's a hard decision to say, we're just not going to put our effort there because it's not going to pay off. So in the scenario that you're describing, you got all this sprawl. The first thing I'll try to coach the team on is like, what are we not going to do? And what is our principle around deciding what not to do? Because if we don't have a principle, then and the next time we encounter this problem again, we're gonna solve it from scratch. But if we have a principle that says we're only going to prioritize the highest performance, for example, or the things that move the needle most on accessibility, well, we can use that principle as a guideline moving forward, and it makes the next decisions easier. So a lot of times, especially a new design system team, they don't have that muscle developed of let's decide together what not to do. Let's agree together what we're not going to do. And let's broadcast that to say like, these two teams were actually, it's not part of our purview to migrate or to consolidate. What we are going to do is we're going to move us toward the next generation of our design language. That's the charge that we pick right now. So that means these other two things are not in our scope. Not because they're not good ideas, not because we hate it, not because you're evil, but because that's just not what's in our scope right now. We're focused on this. This is what we're going to do. So like, I remember hearing this quote that like what defines a museum is not the stuff that's on the walls, it's the stuff that's off the walls, right? So if you go to a museum and there's all Cubist art on the walls, well, yes, it's a Cubist museum because of that, but it's actually more a Cubist museum because there's not Renaissance art or Baroque art or any other kind of art on the walls. So it's what's off the walls. So I think a lot of design systems don't have that muscle. They can't decide what not to do. They want to do everything, as they should. That's great. It's a good opportunity, but that's very paralyzing. So I think the first thing I would try to coach them to do is go, let's make a principle for what our focus is for the next quarter. And then let's be relentless about that focus and try to achieve that.
I love that. I love that quote too. And I want everyone on YouTube and LinkedIn to know that we will be doing a Q&A. So if you've got questions, start throwing them in about 5 or 10 minutes. We'll be answering those. So, like you've got, again, the startup analogy, you're spinning up this design team and you're trying to get this product to market, but you're still under that zero curve, right? You haven't had that uptick yet. And the bleeding is happening. It's clear buy-in is starting to wane a little bit. And you're kind of looking at everything and going like, what are we doing wrong? What's not working? How do you stop the bleeding? Like, what do you start to look at to say, how do we stop this from becoming another casualty to the graveyard?
Yep. I think this ties back really nicely to something that you asked earlier, which is like, do most design systems look like the shiny ones that are out there? Like, do they all look like the material designs and the ant designs and the, like the chakras of the world? And like, the answer is no. When design system teams start to look outward and go like, oh, Polaris, Shopify's Polaris looks awesome. It does. It's great. It's great look. Ooh, this other company like, Lyft's design system or Airbnb's design or Uber's, like all of those, Audi's design system, they're all awesome. None of them are for you. If you keep comparing yourself to those, it will always be short. You'll always be like, we're always going to be under zero. So instead of looking at those, look intrinsically. Is your design system today solving more problems than your design system was yesterday? If it is, that's progress. And that's the thing that you're supposed to track is progress, but not progress against material design. Like progress against material, that's like, it's like saying, am I a good basketball player? Well, and I look at Michael Jordan, like, no, I'm not a good basketball player. Of course you're not. He's the best in the world ever. You know, he's the GOAT. So like, don't compare yourself to the GOAT. Compare yourself to like, is it better than yesterday? If it is, you're actually moving toward zero, toward positive on that curve. If it's not, that's a good self-reflection point to go, okay, what can we do differently to be better than yesterday or to be better than today? So I think a lot of it needs to be intrinsic reflection, not external reflection. I think that's a tough, that's a depressing thing to do.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, and it is. You'll beat yourself up. I've smashed my head into the wall over and over trying to figure out how do I get to an MVP of that, and it took me a while to realize like that was not the right map to use.
Yeah.
And with that point, the kind of the last scenario I want to ask you, and this really ties into I think a lot of what your workbook. I think we just lost. Give us a sec. I think we just lost and. What's great though about design system in 90 days, and I really wish I had this. Here we go. We got you back now.
Sorry about that. Yeah, something dropped off.
Yeah, no worries. But I was going to say what's really great about design system in 90 days is I think you really do give a game plan on how to approach this in like a really practical way, because that's the daunting thing. And I do the metaphor is it's a maze, right? Like you have a maze, and I know exactly what this feels like because I've been in this position a couple of times where I've got buy-in, like I could sell the idea. I know all the things to say. I know the metrics to show, and I see what the North Star could be. But how do we actually start to roll this out? So the final scenario before we take some questions that I have for you is, that designer, sword and shield in hand, or maybe a better analogy here is like a compass and map, and they're about to walk this maze of complexity. What are some of the key things that I should start thinking? I mean, there's a lot of things I could probably focus on. What would you put on the wall of that museum for that designer trying to get this thing off the ground?
Can I throw another metaphor into there?
Yeah, please.
I'm gonna use cooking as a metaphor. So
okay,
like,
I like that.
Great kitchen, and maybe because I just watched The Bear recently, and I love like good kitchens have people at different stations to do different things. Right? To me, design system is a team sport. Like it's not a thing that you can do on your own. That's why, that's part of the reason we don't have a student discount for this workbook. Not because I don't want to give students access to this, but I'm like, if you're trying to do this on your own, it will be very overwhelming. This is a workbook that's designed for teams to do together. So, if you're a designer going through the maze, or if you're in the kitchen and your job is you are the patissier, I don't know how you say that word. The person who makes the desserts, right? Like,
right.
Like that means that you are also not the person who's making the entrees. You're not the person that is, preparing the mise en place, or that means you have a job to do, and your job is not to do everything. So I think if you're the lone person like trying to go through this maze together, again back to the last scenario, like do what you can do what is your job, and decide what you're not going to do. Right? Decide that like at this time we're just not going to have these components in code. Like so, and that is a deficit. Acknowledge that that's a deficit. I see a lot of teams that are like, we have a finished design system, and what they mean is we have a finished like UI kit in Figma, which is a good thing. But if you consider it finished, that's a problem. If you consider like we made one step forward, that's great. That's a really good thing. So I think like if you're a lone person, doing this, pick your lane. And it could be any lane. I'm not saying if you're a designer, pick the design stuff. If you're a designer, you can pick 5 things, but don't pick 11. It doesn't matter what the 5 things are, but if don't pick 11 things because you're just going to be overwhelmed. I tried to cook dinner yesterday, and I had like steak in the oven, and I had rice cooking, and then I was trying to boil some corn, and I was just so overwhelmed by it because there was so much to do. And then my kids tried to talk to me about today, like their schedule and wanting to hang out with friends, and I was just like everyone stop, like everybody be quiet, because it was just too much to do. And it was because I chose to do too much at that moment. So my first answer is like, pick a thing that you will accomplish. There is a lot of stuff to accomplish in design system land. You don't have to do all of it. If you are better today than yesterday, that's good. That's progress. And I think design systems are about progress. Like I think that perfection, completion is not the goal on a design system, but the pursuit is worthy, right? So keep moving toward it. Even if you might never get there, it's still helpful for people the better and better the design system gets.
So who specifically did you write the workbook for?
Interdisciplinary teams. So, I think in the foreword or in the introduction, there's like, here's what we think of as like a great design system team. It's like 8 people. So design system product owner. There's probably some like lead and associate designers, lead and associate engineers. Probably you have a producer or project manager on the team, maybe even a writer or a business analyst. That group of people, that's who the workbook is for. So like, even if you look at the first couple chapters, it's more like, in the beginning of every chapter, we have kind of a DAISY matrix, right? That says like, who is the driver, who is the accountable parties, who are the consulted parties and the informed parties. And it basically breaks down, okay, this person is supposed to do this thing while this other person is going to do something else. And I think that's the way the design system works, is sometimes the designer's doing this thing with the engineer. Sometimes the product manager is doing this other thing while the engineer and the designer are doing this thing. Sometimes everybody's working together. Sometimes everybody is doing their own individual things. And that's why I think it's important to have someone who can coordinate that. That's why the producer, project manager is included. But I think design systems there's a lot of things to do concurrently. Some people have to be talking to the stakeholders and keeping them updated, while other people are building components, while other people are talking and evangelizing to other product teams to try and sell them on the, like, there's a lot of things to do. So this workbook is really for teams and trying to say, okay, you do this, you do that, you do these things, you two work together, and give people some of a roadmap for like, these are the groups and these are the things that should be happening concurrently, and these are the things that can happen separately.
I'm so stoked to jump into this thing, man. Where can I find it?
It's on the Super Friendly website. If you Google design system in 90 days, you'll find it there. It's pinned to my Twitter, the top of my Twitter. I'm Dan Mall at Twitter. So lots of different ways, and I'm sure if there's like show notes or something, we can put them in there too.
Yep, absolutely. I'll have that in the description. All right, so I want to go ahead and take a few questions with the 10 minutes left. Alfredo, what do we got?
Sounds good. We have a couple questions that were already addressed throughout the podcast. However, if we have time, we'll go back to those as well.
Cool.
Our first question is from Sean Lynch. We have a development component library within Storybook and Figma design system. How would you connect the two?
Oh, Sean, great question. That comes up all the time. Thank you for asking this. And I don't have a good answer for it. This is another example of like design system tooling is early. So how do you connect Storybook and a Figma design system? Good luck. Manually is usually the answer. It's tough. And to me, the connection is not in the tooling. The connection is in the process. How do you connect a Figma file with a Storybook file? It's hard to. I have a little asterisk, on there, but it's hard to in general. How do you connect the designer working on that and the engineer working on that? That's easier to do, right? But it might not be culturally appropriate. So that's why you got to work on the culture stuff first. If the designer knows that this thing is a thing that they're going to update, the engineer can do that concurrently. If the engineer asks for an update on something or lets people know, hey, I'm updating this thing, the designer can do that. But a lot of that process is actually manual. Now, that said, there's a lot of tools that are coming out lately. I think they're early. I think, what is the name of it? I think there's one called Story to Dev or something like that. I think it's by the Backlight team. And that's one of those tools that sort of like import your, if I understand correctly, import your React library and create Figma files from it, right? So it's kind of an automated way to do that. So that's cool. Like that kind of stuff is cool. There are other tools. I think Interplay, I'm not sure if they still do this. At some point, it was like you can kind of like import your React library and manipulate it like a design GUI like Figma. So there are lots of tools that are investigating this idea. But right now, at least for me, I haven't seen anything that's like a slam dunk on literally connecting the tooling of Storybook to the tooling of Figma.
So in Vision App DSM, they, again, early, and they had like a mechanism for showing, so you could like use their craft plugin and it would port the component over as a static visual to their documentation. And then another tab would be integrated into Storybook. So it would pull the code part, and it was kind of clunky and it wasn't great, but it was like maybe one solution. And to your point, if you're not trying to like be the Polaris, that could be good enough for now,
Totally.
So that's,
yes.
I just wanted to offer that as something
I think
kind of worked for us.
The gap in those kind of tools is almost all of them go one way, right? You start with the React code and then it creates a Figma file, or you create a Figma file and it creates the React code.
Mm-hmm.
Whoever cracks round tripping, that's gonna be the winner of this, is because that's how work works. Hot potato. So your tools need to be able to hot potato also. I make a change in the code, it happens in the design files. I make a change in the design files, it happens in code. That's why design tokens are such a great thing, is because with good design tokens, the idea should be you change it in one place and everybody gets that change for free. So I think we're still waiting on tooling that does that from a component standpoint.
Round trip, you heard it here. Make the tool and just call it round trip. That's go to market right there.
I'll be the first investor.
Good question.
Next question is from Froglix Fried on YouTube. How do you encourage all design team members to learn how to maintain the design system? I've encountered issues with this at a previous job.
That's a good one. I think that the abstract question below this is like, how do you get people to do anything that is not their job or that they don't want to do, right? How do you change their minds on do that? To me, the answer is you somehow have to address their risk. If a designer is like, why would I maintain a design system? It's because there's risk to them in doing that. What are they going to lose if they do that? Well, if I spend my time, and if you ask them about it, generally you'll get to an answer that's like, if I spend my time updating that, I won't actually have time to do this other thing that I have to do. And at some point, there's some fear or loss or something, and you have to address that part first. So I think part of it is find incentives. Like sometimes what's enough for a designer or an engineer to maintain the design system is like you get an award at the end of the week. Like you'll get applause in Slack, from everybody. Like sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's like the person who updates and maintains the most components this week gets like $100 gift card. Like sometimes it's a financial incentives. Everybody has different incentives. So I think it's about finding the incentive for the team. If there's no incentive and there's a lot of risk, of course people aren't going to do it. Why would they? Like, no, thanks. I'll just do what I'm doing right now. Like, because I'm not losing anything. I'm not going to get fired. I'm going to do a good job. So I think you've got to find incentive for people to want to maintain the design system. Otherwise, I think it'll be really difficult.
Great question.
Our next question comes from Donna on YouTube. Design tokens are so hot. Have you explored abstracting and aliasing tokens rather than unique tokens, such as company color versus primary color?
Hi, Donna. Donna's my friend. Yes, design tokens are so hot. I think early in those, but there's a lot of good progress on tooling on that. Product plug, sort of product plug. I was working on a thing called Arcade. Me and two co-founders started a company to maintain, create, manage design tokens, and I think that's the guts of any good design token tool. We stopped working on that just because we were bootstrapping it and it's hard. I think that's the guts of any good design token tool is they have to be abstracted. If they're not abstracted, then you're basically just like it's one level shy of hard coding values, and that really doesn't have any value to them. So I think that the way to do that is the important thing. Like what is the methodology for abstracting tokens? I know Brad Frost just wrote a great article about it recently, talking about themable tokens, where he talks about different tiers of design tokens. The Adobe Spectrum team has a really great primer on their design tokens, part of their reference website that says, like, I think it's something like, here are their global tokens, and then they have some alias tokens, and then here are component level tokens. So I think the system, obviously the system of how you're actually managing tokens is an important one. And honestly, getting people to agree to that system and use it the way that you intend to, that's the hard part. So I think like one of the things that we were tackling with Arcade is it's not enough to just build a tool around it. We have to educate people on how to use the tool, so a lot of the things that I say with design system teams a lot is tools and rules. And I think both of them have to come together. If we just have rules, but we don't have tools, that sucks. But if we just have tools and we don't have rules, that sucks too. So I think that if we can come up with some good combo about like, here's the tool that we have, and there are good tools for design tokens. One is called Figma Tokens. It's done by a friend named Jan Six, and he has a few folks working with him. I forget their names, but that's an awesome tool for Figma. And what's cool about it is it's a tool, and I think each team needs to come up with their rules about how they use that. And I think that's the kind of stuff that makes teams successful.
Who should be the author of design tokens?
Only one or two people. And it's a complicated question because which design tokens are you talking about? Mm-hmm. Global, the answer is different than alias. The answer is different than component. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the kind of rule, that's the kind of governance I think that design tokens need, is to say, these folks can touch this. And, I'll spoil it. This is not really a spoiler, but like one of our big philosophies when we were working on Arcade is what people haven't cracked yet is permissions on design tokens. Right, everybody's building a tool and everyone can edit everything. And that's actually one of the problems with design tokens is if everybody can edit everything, that is a huge risk. You don't want your intern changing global brand color somewhere, right? By accident. That's a problem. It's not an unrecoverable problem, but ideally you want to prevent that from happening. So only these folks at this level should be able to touch these. Only the design system team should be able to touch these. These people can consume these, but not use these. Like, I think there's a lot of governance that needs to go around design tokens.
Awesome. Great question. I think we got time for one more.
Our next question is from Isabel. Should teams consuming the design system that are creating products for end users be the source of informing future iterations to the system? Should the DS team be a source as well to make updates to patterns?
Yes. Thank you for asking that question, Isabel. I appreciate that. One of the things that I see a lot of people get wrong and get frustrated about with governance and with contribution in particular is I think they think that each team does the wrong thing. So I love the way that you phrase this question because I think it's a successful way to do it. I think the design system team should be the major contributors to the design system. I think a lot of people think like, oh, the users of the design system need to contribute back to it. And I'm like, but why? That's not their jobs. Their jobs are to create products. The design system team is supposed to be the team listening to what they need and what they're doing, and perhaps taking the work that they do and abstracting it to contribute it back to the design system. And then when possible, creating some mechanisms for contribution. But I don't think that it's realistic to say the folks that are working on the products themselves should actually be the ones contributing. You just doubled their jobs. And then what does the design system job become? Like design system team's job become. So I think a lot of the work is actually distributed poorly in a lot of those places. And if you just move them around a little bit, if you say the design system's job, the design system team's job is to be the major contributors to the design system, but informed by the work that the product teams are doing. A lot of the way that I try to teach it is you extract from the product work into the design system. You extract and abstract. That's one of those rules, right? That and guidelines is you extract it. If a team has come up with a really great, custom dropdown, and you see 6 other teams need this custom dropdown right now, don't make the team that invented it be the one to contribute it. They don't know what those other teams are needing it for. As a design system team, you do know what those teams, you're supposed to know what those teams need it for. So you should do the work to abstract it to the right level so that like, oh, these other 5 teams, if we just make these tweaks, if we make this thing optional and not required, then all these other teams can use it. That one team that created it, they just created it for themselves. So I think if you distribute the work better, I think contribution becomes much easier.
And there you have it. Nugget after nugget. Dan, I appreciate your time, man. This topic I could talk to for hours. I think this is such a huge part of our industry and a lot of exciting stuff happening in it. And I'm very grateful that you created Design System in 90 days. I think something we really need. So please check that out. If you have any more questions, follow Dan Mall on Twitter. And Dan, if you could stick around for 1 minute. Everyone else, we will see you next time on Zero Content Design Show.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks, everyone.